The phone is face down on the table, but your body still knows where it is. It keeps checking the air around you, as if a message might arrive through silence itself. You tell yourself you miss him, and that is true enough. But if you are honest, there is something stranger underneath that. It is not only him you miss. It is the version of you that existed in the space around him. The version that hoped. The version that interpreted every pause. The version that could turn a small sign into a whole future. That is the part that aches in a way you did not expect. Because a man can leave, or go quiet, or become emotionally unavailable. And what hurts most is not always the man. Sometimes what hurts is the collapse of the story you built around him. The mind can survive disappointment. The body can survive disappointment. But the fantasy has its own gravity. It holds a woman in place long after the facts have changed. And that is why, sometimes, you do not miss him in the full human sense. You miss the atmosphere he created in your imagination. You miss the almost, the maybe, the version of him who existed in the private cinema of your mind, where every glance meant something, every delay had a hidden reason, every silence still felt like a connection. The fantasy is seductive because it asks so little from reality and gives so much to longing. A real person has edges. A real person disappoints, forgets, hesitates, misreads, avoids, and reveals himself in ways your heart may not want to see. But the fantasy is smooth. The fantasy never interrupts you. It never says no. It never looks away at the wrong moment. It never makes you feel small. It never has a bad day. It never fails to become who you need. So of course the fantasy is hard to release. And this is where the pain becomes more precise. You are not only grieving what happened, you are grieving what could have been if the story had stayed inside your control. If he had remained a symbol instead of becoming a person. If the feeling had stayed pure instead of becoming complicated. If the image had never collided with the truth. Carl Jung would have understood this collision immediately, because he spent his life studying what happens when the unconscious projects an inner image onto someone outside us. We do not just see the person in front of us. We also see what that person awakens. We see our own hidden longing, our own unfinished story, our own unmet need dressed up in the face of another human being. That is projection. And projection is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is not something only naive people do. Projection is part of being human. The psyche reaches outward and clothes the unknown in familiar emotional shapes. It takes what is buried inside and places it on a living screen. Sometimes that screen is a lover. Sometimes it is a parent. Sometimes it is a friend. Sometimes it is a stranger who feels strangely significant from the first moment. What you call chemistry is often the unconscious recognizing a pattern before the conscious mind can explain it. That is why the fantasy can feel more powerful than the man. The fantasy is not only about him. It is about the part of you that lit up in his presence. The part that felt chosen, seen, desired, or finally on the verge of being understood. Even if he gave very little, the psyche can turn very little into a huge internal event. And once that happens, you are no longer only attached to a person. You are attached to an inner experience. That is the deeper wound. You may think you miss his voice, his hands, the way he smiled, the way he made a room feel different. But look closer. What was the emotional promise hidden inside those details? Did he make you feel like the woman you wanted to be? Did he make you feel temporarily rescued from loneliness? Did he make you feel as if your life was about to make sense? Did he make you feel worthy because he noticed you? The fantasy is often built from a need the real person never consciously agreed to carry. And that is why the loss feels so disproportionate. It is not only the loss of a relationship, it is the loss of a psychological container. There is a quiet cruelty in this, because the mind can keep replaying the best moments like proof. The late-night conversation, the unexpected tenderness, the one message that felt alive, the look that seemed to say more than words, the almost confession, the moment you thought, yes, this is real. And then the silence arrives, or the inconsistency, or the distance, and instead of letting the whole structure collapse, the psyche starts editing. It keeps the bright scenes and blurs the rest. That is how fantasy survives. It survives through selective memory, emotional hunger, and the refusal to fully mourn. Because mourning is not just sadness. Mourning is surrendering the image. And surrendering the image can feel like betrayal. It can feel like admitting you were wrong. It can feel like standing in a room where the walls you painted yourself are suddenly gone. But this is only the surface. The deeper truth is more uncomfortable. Sometimes the fantasy is not just sweeter than the man. Sometimes it protects you from the actual man. The fantasy keeps you from seeing the full truth, because the full truth would require a response, a boundary, a disappointment you can no longer romanticize, a decision. And the psyche often prefers longing to clarity, because longing still contains hope. Hope can become a drug, not hope in the healthy sense, not the quiet human ability to believe in life. I mean the kind of hope that keeps a woman emotionally tethered to a situation that no longer feeds her. The kind of hope that says, maybe if I understand him better, maybe if I wait a little longer, maybe if I become easier to love, maybe if I stop asking for so much, maybe if I say it more gently, maybe if I disappear for a while, he will realize. That kind of hope is not really hope. It is postponement. And postponement is one of the favorite strategies of the wounded psyche. It delays grief. It delays truth. It delays the moment when the person in front of you is finally seen as they are, not as you wish they were. Jung would call this the power of the unconscious to shape perception. We are not neutral observers of our love life. We are participants in it. We bring our complexes to the table. We bring our abandonment fears, our hunger for recognition, our old wounds around being chosen, our need to be special, our terror of being ordinary and overlooked. And then we look at a man through all of that. Suddenly he is not just a man. He becomes a mirror. Sometimes he becomes the mirror of your feminine longing. Sometimes he becomes the mirror of your unhealed father wound. Sometimes he becomes the mirror of the part of you that still believes love must be earned through patience, sacrifice, and emotional endurance. Sometimes he becomes the mirror of a girl who once waited for someone to come back and never fully stopped waiting. That is why this hurts so deeply. The present moment is not the only thing being activated. An old inner room is opening too. And in that room, the fantasy does what fantasy always does. It fills the empty spaces with meaning. It says, this is rare, this is faded, this is unfinished, this has depth, this is not over. And maybe some connections do have depth. Maybe some do remain psychologically unfinished. But depth is not the same as destiny. Intensity is not the same as truth. And a strong inner reaction is not proof that this person is meant for you. Sometimes it only proves that something in you is ready to be seen. That is a hard sentence, because it removes the comfort of certainty. It asks you to stop asking, what does he mean? And begin asking, what does this awaken in me? That shift is everything. Because once you ask the second question, the whole scene changes. You stop organizing your nervous system around his next move. You stop reading the timestamps, the online status, the tone of the last message, the half-hearted explanation, the accidental like, the sudden withdrawal, the tiny breadcrumb that keeps your hope alive. You stop treating his inconsistency like a riddle that will eventually reward you if you solve it. And instead, you begin to notice the real pattern. You notice that what you miss is not just him, but the state of anticipation, the state of emotional high alert, the state of living in possibility instead of presence, the state where every silence could still become a miracle, the state where your imagination kept the relationship alive, even when reality was giving you less and less. This is where the persona comes in. A persona is the face we present to the world, but it can also become the role we perform inside love. For some women, the persona is the understanding one, the easy one, the one who does not ask for too much, the one who can read the room, absorb the mood, soften the tension, and make herself smaller so the connection can continue. She becomes the woman who can adapt to almost anything, as long as she does not have to face the grief of not being chosen fully. And if that has been your role, then the fantasy is not just about him. It is about the role that let you survive the uncertainty. Because the fantasy says, if I keep believing, I do not have to feel the full weight of what is missing. But the cost is high. The cost is that you keep returning to a man who may never have been able to hold the depth you were assigning to him. Or maybe he could hold some of it, but not in the way you needed. Or maybe the connection was real in feeling, but not sustainable in reality. The point is not to reduce every story to cynicism. The point is to stop confusing emotional intensity with mutual capacity. That is a very Jungian lesson, because Jung was always interested in the tension between image and reality, between the symbolic and the literal, between what the psyche means and what life actually is. A symbol can be true without being literal. A feeling can be real without being a contract. A meaningful encounter can still be incomplete, and a powerful projection can feel like love, while actually revealing the shape of your own unmet need. This is why some women miss the fantasy more than the man. The fantasy gave them a place to put their longing. It gave them a story with momentum. It gave them the possibility of being transformed by someone else's attention. And that possibility can feel intoxicating when your own life has been too dry, too repetitive, too heavy, too lonely. If your days have been filled with responsibility, emotional labor, self-control, and quiet endurance, then the fantasy arrives like water in a desert. Of course you want to drink. Of course you want to believe. Of course you want the man to be more than he is, because the inner thirst is real. But thirst can make a mirage look like a home. And here's the part most people avoid. Sometimes the fantasy survives because it flatters the wound. It tells the abandoned part of you that this time, the story is special. This time, the waiting has meaning. This time, the distance is proof of depth. This time, the pain is not a warning sign, but a sign of how rare this connection is. That can be a very dangerous spell, because then you are not just attached to him, you are attached to the meaning of your suffering. You start to fear that letting go would make the pain meaningless, as if the suffering must be justified by the right ending, as if the fantasy must be preserved so the waiting was not wasted, as if giving up the image would erase the emotional investment you made. But no, letting go does not erase what you felt. It honors it by refusing to lie about it. You can say, yes, this mattered to me. You can say, yes, I was moved. You can say, yes, I projected. And yes, I hoped. And yes, I built something in my inner world that maybe never had enough outer substance. That is not humiliation. That is maturity. And maturity is often what the fantasy resists the most. Because maturity asks you to see the man as he is, not as the story made him. It asks you to notice the difference between a person who appears emotionally deep and a person who can actually sustain depth. It asks you to separate charisma from character, longing from compatibility, and potential from presence. Potential is one of the most seductive words in love. Potential lets you stay in a relationship with what is not there yet. Potential lets you ignore the evidence. Potential lets you build a cathedral out of unfinished bricks. Potential says, he could be. But love cannot live on could be forever. At some point, the psyche has to ask, what is? And what is, often, is simpler and sadder than the fantasy. He is inconsistent. He is unavailable. He is unclear. He is present when it suits him and distant when emotion becomes real. Or maybe he is kind but not committed. Or maybe he is interested but not capable. Or maybe he offered enough to awaken your hope, but not enough to meet your heart. That is painful. But pain is not the enemy here. Confusion is. Because confusion keeps the fantasy alive. Once clarity arrives, fantasy begins to lose oxygen. That does not mean you stop caring overnight. It does not mean you suddenly feel nothing. It means the emotional loop begins to break. And when it breaks, the grief becomes cleaner. Cleaner grief is hard, but it is honest. It lets you mourn the actual thing instead of the imagined one. And this is where the shadow enters. The shadow is not only the dark part of your personality, it is also the part of you that you do not want to admit is there. The part that wants more than is available. The part that prefers the fantasy because the truth feels too ordinary, too final, too humiliating. The part that keeps replaying the story because it cannot yet bear the emptiness that would remain if the story ended. You may even feel ashamed of how much you miss him, but perhaps what you miss is not a person at all. Perhaps you miss being in a state where your heart felt activated. Perhaps you miss the feeling of being on the edge of something. Perhaps you miss the idea that your life was about to change because of love. And if that is true, then the longing is not a flaw. It is information. It tells you where your life has been starved. It tells you where you have been waiting for something outside yourself to deliver aliveness, meaning, or worth. That is why the fantasy can become so powerful in a woman who has spent too long being practical, contained, or emotionally self-sufficient. The fantasy promises a doorway out of numbness, but if you are not careful, it also becomes a doorway out of yourself. And Jung would say that any image that pulls you away from your own center needs to be examined. Not destroyed, examined. Because the psyche does not hand us these images for no reason. It is trying to show us where we have become split. It is trying to show us where we have handed our power to someone else's behavior. The real question is not, why was he like this? The real question is, why did my inner world invest so much in someone who could not hold it? That question is not meant to blame you. It is meant to free you. Because once you see the mechanism, you stop worshiping the outcome. You stop treating his return, his apology, his clarity, or his attention like the only thing that can save the story. You begin to understand that the story itself was built on a psychic need, and that need can be met in healthier, more grounded ways. Maybe the need was to feel chosen. Maybe it was to feel seen. Maybe it was to feel desired without having to perform. Maybe it was to feel that your tenderness would not be wasted. Maybe it was to feel that love could arrive without you having to chase it. Whatever the need is, it is yours to understand now, not his to fix, not the fantasies to maintain, yours to understand. There is a moment in every painful attachment when the body starts telling the truth before the mind does. You feel tired after thinking about him. You feel hollow after rereading the messages. You feel restless after checking the phone. You feel a strange drop in your stomach when you imagine him with someone else. Not because you want him back exactly, but because the fantasy is being challenged. The body knows when a story is costing too much. That exhaustion is not random. It is the nervous system beginning to reject the loop. And if you have been calling that exhaustion missing him, this may be the moment to rename it. Maybe you are not only missing him, maybe you are exhausted from carrying an emotional narrative that no longer feeds you. Maybe you are tired of acting like uncertainty is intimacy. Maybe you are weary of waiting for a man to become the meaning your imagination already gave him. That is a turning point, because once you can name the fatigue correctly, you can stop romanticizing it. And when you stop romanticizing it, you create space for the truth to enter. The truth may be that he was a catalyst, not a home. The truth may be that he activated an old wound, not a lifelong destiny. The truth may be that he showed you how easily you can project depth onto someone who only offered fragments. The truth may be that your longing was bigger than the relationship. And the truth may also be that this is not a tragedy, it is a revelation. Revelation can be painful, but it is cleaner than illusion. At some point, you may notice something subtle. You may notice that the fantasy begins to feel less romantic and more repetitive. The same scene, the same hope, the same explanation, the same imagined conversation, the same mental negotiation, the same internal plea for one more sign, one more message, one more chance to make the story mean what you wanted it to mean. That repetition is the psyche trying to keep the attachment alive by recycling emotion. And this is where many women mistake persistence for depth. They think, if I keep feeling this strongly, it must mean something. But sometimes the strongest feelings are not the truest feelings. Sometimes they are just the most activated. Sometimes they are the echo of a complex, not the voice of love. A complex is a knot of emotion and memory that gets triggered by certain people or situations. When it is activated, you do not respond only to the present. You respond to the present plus the past. That is why one man can feel enormous. He may be carrying an old emotional weight that does not belong to him alone. He may have touched a place in you that was waiting to be touched for years. That does not make the connection fake. It makes it psychologically real. But psychologically real is not the same as relationally healthy. That distinction matters. Because the moment you stop confusing activation with destiny, you regain your footing. You can still honor what happened without building your life around it. You can still admit the depth without feeding the loop. You can still feel the ache without turning it into a prophecy. And if you are waiting for the fantasy to end all at once, it may not. Usually it dissolves in layers. First, the intensity softens. Then the compulsive checking loses its hold. Then the imagination stops producing the same scenes with the same force. Then you realize one day that you have not thought about him for hours. And later, maybe for a whole day. And then you understand that what you were calling love was also a habit of mind. That realization can feel almost shocking, because it reveals how much of your emotional life was being organized around an absence. But there is no shame in that. There is only a call to return. Return to the room you actually live in. Return to the body you keep leaving behind when you chase the fantasy. Return to the work, the friendships, the routines, the quiet moments, the parts of life that do not need to be imagined into significance because they already exist. Return to your own center. That is individuation in the simplest language. Not becoming perfect, not becoming detached in a cold way, not pretending you never wanted him. Individuation is the slow process of becoming less divided inside yourself. It is the movement from projection back to ownership, from fantasy back to reality, from unconscious longing back to conscious choice. And yes, choice can feel less dramatic than fantasy. but it is also more freeing, because choice does not ask you to keep worshiping a possibility. Choice asks you to stand in the truth of what is in front of you and decide what honors your dignity. That may mean leaving the conversation unfinished. It may mean letting the message remain unsent. It may mean no longer checking whether he has seen your story, your post, your silence, your absence. It may mean allowing the fantasy to die without forcing a dramatic ending. It may mean grieving privately until your heart is no longer negotiating with a ghost. There is a quiet strength in that. Not the strength of pretending you are unaffected. The strength of no longer feeding what drains you. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself tonight. Just one. Not for anyone else. Not for him. For you. Let it be simple. Let it be true. Because the sentence you write for yourself can become a small act of return. And maybe your sentence will sound something like this. I miss the feeling more than the person. Or, I was attached to the hope. Or, I want reality, not a beautiful confusion. Or, I am ready to stop feeding the image. Those words matter because they interrupt the spell. And once the spell is interrupted, something softer can begin. Not instantly, not perfectly, but softly. You start to see that your longing was trying to tell you something important. It was telling you where you want to be met. It was telling you where you have settled for less than mutuality. It was telling you where you have mistaken emotional activation for emotional safety. That is not failure. That is education. The psyche teaches through pain when we refuse to hear it through gentler means. So let the pain teach you now. Let it show you the difference between being chosen and choosing. Let it show you the difference between being desired and being known. Let it show you the difference between a man who enters your life and a fantasy that enters your nervous system. Let it show you the difference between longing for a person and longing for the feeling that person awakened. And when you can tell those apart, you begin to reclaim your power. Not by hardening, not by punishing yourself for having hoped, not by pretending the whole thing was nothing. You reclaim your power by seeing clearly, by grieving honestly, by refusing to make the fantasy more important than your own peace. There may come a day when you remember him and feel almost surprised by how little it hurts. Not because you became cold, but because you became whole enough to stop feeding what was never fully alive. You may remember the phone, the silence, the waiting, the little private theater in your mind, and instead of longing, you feel tenderness. Tenderness for the woman who waited. Tenderness for the part of you that needed a story. Tenderness for the fact that she was trying to love something into existence. That tenderness is not weakness. It is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom does not demand that you erase the fantasy with contempt. It asks you to see it clearly, bless the lesson, and step out of the room where the projection kept you small. It asks you to come back to the chair, to the table, to the open window, to the ordinary light of your own life. It asks you to sit with the silence without turning it into a prophecy. Because silence, once it is no longer filled with fantasy, becomes space. And space is where you hear yourself again. You hear the part of you that wants a love that is mutual, not imagined. You hear the part of you that no longer wants to build cathedrals out of crumbs. You hear the part of you that is tired of mistaking uncertainty for depth. You hear the part of you that is ready for a different kind of intimacy, one that does not require self-abandonment. That part of you has been waiting too. And unlike the fantasy, it does not disappear when you stop feeding it. It grows stronger. So if tonight your phone stays silent, let it stay silent. If the mind reaches for the old story, let it pass through without obeying it. If you feel the urge to make him larger than he was, breathe and return to the facts. If you feel the ache of missing the fantasy, do not shame yourself for it. Just notice it, name it, and gently, almost quietly, choose reality again. My silence is not a game. It is my return to myself. Say that in your own way. Keep it close. Let it be the line that brings you back when the mind starts decorating absence with meaning. Because the goal was never to win the fantasy. The goal is to wake up inside your own life. And when you do, you may realize that what you thought was love was partly a mirror, partly a wound, and partly a lesson. But your life is bigger than the lesson. Your heart is bigger than the loop, and your future is not waiting inside his silence. It is waiting in the moment you finally stop mistaking the dream for the man.